So last week we talked about organization strategy and innovation, and I explained what organization strategy is in relation to the mission and the vision of an organization. And in the second part of the lecture, we discussed a bunch of strategic tools that you can use to analyze your organization and to kind of analyze if a technology or an innovation is a worthwhile investment. So we discussed a bunch, Porter's 5 Forces, Pestle, and we ended with this one that that is a yeah, I think I discussed this one. Yeah, so this is a tradition in Wiersma value disciplines, which basically state that you have 3 basic areas of focus as an organization: product leadership, operational excellence, customer intimacy, or in other words, the best product, the cheapest way of producing it, and the best customer service. And they argue that you cannot do everything, so you should have a kind of a threshold of like a minimum. So you have to be somewhat efficient, you have to have somewhat an okay product, you have to have some customer service. But after that sort of minimum threshold value, you need to pick 1 or 2 that you focus on. So for example, Apple really focuses on product leadership, while cheaper producing laptop and PC companies may choose operational excellence and focus on making things cheaper. And they say you should do everything a bit, so that's a threshold value, but you cannot do all. You cannot do everything. So there are some organizations that strive toward it, of course. So for example, if you think HEMA and Lidl, they say HEMA is fairly cheap. It has a fairly good brand, so it's quite high in customer image, and also tries to be creative in the products they sell and they offer. But they're not so they are above the threshold, but they're not doing everything like to the max. So they try to be somewhere in the middle. And Tracy and Wiersma usually argue, okay, you have to pick something that you really focus on, that you will excel at. So that's where we ended up, Tracy and Wiersma value discipline. So there were, just for completeness, I also added a SWOT analysis to the list of strategic tools that you can use. I think we don't have to pay much attention to this, because this is quite frankly well known to everyone, I'd say. So strengths, weaknesses, opportunities, threats, so you can analyze your own organization or your innovation or certain technology or whatever by using a SWOT analysis. I think the only thing to remember from a SWOT analysis, of course, besides that it's the strengths, weaknesses, opportunities, threats, is that usually strengths and weaknesses is related to your internal organization, and opportunities, threats to your external organization. So if you do a SWOT analysis of a new innovation, your strengths and weaknesses is, okay, what can we do well, what can we do less well in your organization to make the innovation happen. Opportunities and threats, what happens in the external environment that will help or hinder us from being a success. So that's a SWOT analysis. For the exam, of course, you don't have to remember every bullet point that is listed here, because this is something that I just copied and pasted from Google as well. Oh. Now, things that your company does better than others are your strength. Things that your company does worse than others is your weakness. So when you think about your internal organization, you think about, okay, what am I good at as an organization, and what am I less good at as an organization. In the final lecture, I will talk about the specific exam question, but it consists of a mix of multiple choice and open questions. So I'm not sure yet about the number of multiple choice and open questions. So I'm thinking about somewhere between 20 and 30 multiple choice questions and about 4 open questions. But I'll let you know in due time. For those of you who took communication theory last year, the setup will be basically the same. Besides SWOT, I also included the balanced scorecard as a strategic tool. I also don't want to spend much time to the balanced scorecard. I just want to let you know that this exists, because this is a tool that is used a lot in management and management consultancy. So this is one of the basic tools that managers and if you learn if you are going to be a consultant that you may use to think about organization change and to think about how to implement information technology projects, how to implement an innovation. It may sound quite obvious, but this balanced scorecard hasn't been around for that long, I think maybe 20 years or so. And they were the first to point out that the financial perspective is not the only perspective that an organization should watch out for when innovating or when changing. As I said, completely obvious, but not at the time. So the balanced scorecard says, well, there are basically 4 main areas to focus on when you innovate or when you change your organization or whatever. Of course, the financial perspective, important, but also the buyer's perspective, who's going to use it, who's going to be affected. The internal process perspective, so what happens within the organization when we implement the innovation. And the learning and growth perspective. What about organizational knowledge? What do people have to know? What do people have to learn when there is a change? And that's, of course, all given in by the vision and strategy of the organization. So it's developed to translate strategic objectives, which also can be innovations, into concrete projects, and to set clear objectives and measures and targets. And again, to not only focus on the financial aspects. And so you can use it to initiate an innovation or a IT project based on a certain strategy, and you can assess an innovation with it. Because what the balanced scorecard does, so it identifies these 4 dimensions of that you have to pay attention to when innovating. And it says, okay, you have 4 strategic objectives, but then it makes it much, much more concrete. So they say, okay, you have to attach measures to each of these objectives. So for example, with my innovation, I want to increase my profit margin, or I want to reduce costs. If I innovate because of the customer, my innovation will have certain effects on my customers. Maybe satisfaction is increased, maybe we get new types of customers, well, etc. So you can attach strategic objectives to all of these 4 dimensions. But then, so they say you have to have strategic objectives, but you have to make them measurable. So you have to explain, okay, how will you measure the success of those measures? So for example, profit margin can be expressed in net profit. Corporate culture can be assessed by, for example, doing an internal employee survey and asking your employees, how much do you identify with our organization? So you have to develop concrete, measurable targets for each objective that you have. So you develop measures and then you set targets. And targets are the outcomes of the measure. So for corporate identification, we want people to identify half a point more on a 5-point scale in 2 years. For the net profit, we want to increase our net profit with 5% in 2 years. And they say, once you've done that, then you can set concrete initiatives that will help you attain those strategic objectives. So balanced scorecard is quite useful. It's not really a scientific tool, but it's really a practical tool, but it's really useful to go from, okay, I want to do this, right until the concrete initiatives and the way you are going to measure the success. So this is something that is used often, very often in organizations. So the last strategic tool I want to discuss is McFarlan Strategic Grid. And this is really a tool that is focused on information systems and information technology. Here on the slide it says IS stands for information systems. An information system is an information technology and the way that you should be using it. You should use it and the people that use it. But we'll discuss that in a couple of weeks. But for now, it's about information technology. Is the balanced scorecard useful for your group projects? Well, if you would have a concrete innovation, yes, it is, but it's not in the business plan. So I would not discuss it for now. So it's not in there because I don't want to take the business plan so far that you really have to create concrete measurable objectives for your innovation. So I want you to pay more attention to the general strategy and the organization behind the business plan than concrete measurable success. How can we expect this model in the exam? Is this the balanced scorecard or is this the McFarlan Strategic Grid? The balanced scorecard. How can we expect it in the exam? Well, yeah, oh no, that's okay. I have not made the exam yet, so I cannot tell you yet. But if I'm going to ask a question about it, you could ask a very simple question, you know, a simple knowledge-based question. So list the 4 dimensions of the balanced scorecard: financial, buyers, internal learning, and growth. So that could be one. Or if I wanted to ask a more sophisticated question, you know, that is about more like thinking and analyzing, I could, for example, give a case and then say, well, these are the 4 dimensions of the balanced scorecard. What do you think would be a useful measure and a useful target for this case? So, for example, when I give a case about a product that is clearly related to attaining a new customer group and increasing customer satisfaction, then you could use the balanced scorecard to say, well, this is what we want to measure, and this is how we're going to measure it. So like that. And that's basically, sorry for the distraction, but that's basically the way that all questions are asked. So on the one hand, I'm going to ask a couple of questions which are more knowledge and insight based. So I ask you to explain, for example, McFarlan Strategic Grid, and other questions will be more about analyzing, in which I ask you to solve a case or to answer a case using a certain model. I'll give a couple of examples of questions in the last lecture. Okay, McFarlan Strategic Grid. So this one is quite difficult. It is somewhat theoretical, and again, it is based mostly on information technology, but you can also apply it to innovations. And this model says, well, you can kind of list where your innovation or investment in innovation technology is according to this model. And they say you can use this model as a kind of a tool to assess, okay, should we invest in new technologies? Should we innovate? Or should we just keep it as is? So this model basically says you have technologies that either are important for your daily operations, or technologies that are not that important for your daily operations. So technology that is important for your daily operations is that if it crashes, you can't do your work at all. Technologies that are not that useful for your daily operations are innovations that are that may crash or stop for a day or so, but people can still continue their work. So, for example, in a factory, the whole production line would be a technology that has a high impact on operational performance. So if the production line stops, the whole organization grinds to a halt. So as an organization, you have to make sure that that continues working. On the other hand, you have all kinds of technologies that are just support technologies. You know, you have the human resource department, the financial department, who have lists of systems that keep track of employees. Those are also important, but not that important. So if they stop working for a day, okay, it's a nuisance, but it's not that your organization grinds to a halt. So think Word, PowerPoint in our organization, things like that. Although PowerPoint right now and Zoom are, in this example for this lecture, very important for operational performance. So that's one dimension, that's the y-axis. On the x-axis, it says impact on achieving future strategic objectives. And that means, on the one hand, you can have technology that is just used to do your business. So again, think Word, think your production line, think your basic customer relationship management system, all your basic systems. On the other hand, you have technologies that are very important for your organization's strategy. So those that can make you better than your competitors, so they can lead to competitive advantage. And those are what we generally consider as real innovations. So they're not just, so, and as more radical and architectural innovation. So those are the systems that will, if we implement that, that will lead to a lot of change in the organization, and it will help us be better than our competitors. So those are, for example, maybe like, you know, I think in the last lecture I gave an example of newspaper switching to an online newspaper, and you can read the newspaper with your tablet. So if you were the first newspaper to do that, so if you were the first newspaper that had digital access for the newspaper on a tablet, that would really be strategic. That would really help you attain a new group of customers. However, if you would do it now, it would not be really strategic anymore, because every newspaper has done that. So now it would just be a system that you basically need as a newspaper, because everyone expects it. But for example, now if you have, basically all the ideas you have for your business plan are basically technologies that are strategic systems, because they help you attain new customers, help you, if your innovation is situated in an existing organization, it will help the organization make more profit, be more successful than the competitors, etc. So if you take these two models together, two dimensions together, you get a matrix with 4 types of technology: support, factory, strategic, and turnaround. And support systems are those systems that are not really important for your competitive advantage and are not really important for your daily performance. So think basic systems like your word processor again, and a financial system, or your employee payroll. It is important, but not that important, except if you're a financial organization, of course. But that's support systems. Factory systems are those systems that are really important for your daily performance. So for us, for now, for the university, Zoom is a factory system. It does not give us a competitive edge, because every university is using Zoom, but we do definitely need that to do our daily work. A strategic system then is a system that you think as an organization is really important for your future business success. So you as an organization think we definitely will absolutely need this if we are to survive in the future. So it's critical to future business success and provides competitive advantage. And a turnaround system, finally, is something that may be very important in the future, but it's not yet proven. So those are the technologies and the innovations that are very early in the hype cycle, if you remember. So those are things like augmented reality, artificial intelligence, blockchain. Those are technologies that may be very important, but you don't really know if it's very important for your organization. And this is a pretty useful tool if you work in information technology, but also a pretty useful tool for any innovation. So, for example, if you want to innovate, you should not spend that much time innovating in support systems. You know, these are just updates in systems that you use, like a new Office version, for example, a new email program, things like that. So innovations here in support are usually incremental innovations. They're just not that important. Factory systems is also usually incremental innovations. So those are the systems, the technologies that you absolutely need and use, but they are important to keep your daily business going, but they will not bring anything else. So for example, like I said, Zoom, but also things like internet access for a university it's not something that sets you apart as an organization from other organizations. So if you really want to innovate, you have to think about strategic technologies, about strategic systems, because those are the systems that you definitely want to invest in now, because you think that will make us better than the competitors. So for example, Samsung with its flip phone, I think they really want to make the flip phone a success. So for them, maybe flip phone now is a strategic innovation. Although I'm not really sure what their idea with flip phone is. So finally, turnaround are those innovations, so like virtual reality, augmented reality, like artificial intelligence. They are important to pay attention to as an organization, but they're not that critical yet. But you do have to take them into account because they may be important in the future. For example, if you are a technology organization, Apple, Google, Samsung, and you don't pay attention to virtual reality at all, that may not be wise, because we don't really know what to do with it yet, but it is so hyped and so many organizations are working with it that it is something you need to take into account and maybe invest in. So turnaround is usually the area of the R&D department who really invest in new technologies, who try new technologies out, and some of these technology innovations may become a success, they may be worthwhile, and they then switch to strategic. And in general, you see when you look at adoption curves, so for example, when you look at an S-curve of technology adoption, you see that basically innovations follow this route. So from turnaround to strategic to factory and then maybe to support. So again, if we take the internet, if you were on the internet as an organization in the early 90s, it would really be a turnaround system for you, because you would have no idea why you would have a web page in the first place, because no one is online yet, but maybe it could be a success. Then suddenly it becomes 1995, you're a very small company called Amazon, you think that, okay, maybe we can sell products online with our website. And suddenly for you, the internet has become strategic. The internet has become strategic. Because for you, it's very important to do your business, and it sets you apart from your competitors. Well, 20 years later, it has become a factory system. So your website, or maybe even support, but depends on the organization. Because now, when you have a web shop, it does not set you apart from the competitors at all. So again, if 25 years ago you would say, let's use the internet, it would be turned around. If 20 years ago you would say, okay, let's use the internet for a web shop, it would be strategic, would set you apart from the competitors. Now it would be factory and support because everyone has access to the same technology. So again, this is, I think, a very useful tool to think about the role of technology and the role of innovations in your organization. And it's also, I think, a very practical tool to decide as a manager, okay, what should we invest in? So turnaround systems, maybe non-proven, but not paying attention at all is unwise. On the other hand, strategic systems, they are critical for your future success, you think, so you should invest a lot in these types of systems, etc. So in the examples I gave before, it's quite important to realize that that you cannot just simply apply a technology to this model. So it's not that every technology will be a turnaround system, period. So it depends on the organization and the time, the situation, if a system for you is a turnaround, a factory, or a support system. So like I said, the internet 25 years ago was turnaround, the internet now is factory. And it can also be different for different organizations. So for banks, maybe blockchain for them is more strategic than it is for other organizations. So it really depends on the type of organization. So do not generalize, it depends on the time and the situation and the type of organization and the type of technology, what the technology is, so in which quadrant the technology is situated for you. Okay. So that was the last model, and so we discussed basically a bunch of different models, and this is the only one that is a model that is created mostly with innovation and technology in mind. So I think this is a pretty important model for technology. Okay. The next thing I want to explain are very shortly different modeling types. And I don't want to go into this in detail because there are a lot of different ways of modeling organizations. But I want to shortly explain one way of thinking about modeling in an organization. Well, what is modeling? Modeling is mapping, like drawing, writing down, the way in which an organization or an aspect of an organization functions. So for example, I could model this interaction with I and the teacher, and then arrow student, and then another arrow back feedback, which kind of lists the information flows in the organization. I could be even more specific. I could say, well, I, teacher, arrow, students using voice and audiovisual communication, and then student, arrow, teacher via chat. And then we have mapped the communication channels in our small organization right now. So that's a modeling type. But you have different types of modeling. So in general, you have three. So I'll start at the bottom. So you can model at the most core level, and that's data modeling. So that's what you model in databases. So for example, if I go on a website and I place an order, I have to fill in my first name, last name, postal code, city. I have to fill in a lot of information in each cell, so in each input field of the form. And those are put into a database together with my order. And you can model that. Basically, you have to model that in order to understand how technology works and how information flows in an organization. Because databases are the core of basically all information technologies. And you can model everything that goes in and comes out of a database. So if I fill in a form on a website, I fill in a number of fields and I place my order, that gets put into a database. And then other people will access the database, or other systems will access the database and will retrieve information from the database. So to bill me, to send a product to me, to have the information to create the product. And that is called data modeling. So the way you model data in databases and think about, okay, how should we store that in databases so that it's easy to access for others, is data modeling. And again, because databases are so central to information technologies, we are going to spend a lecture and an assignment on data modeling and on the way databases function. But we do that in lecture 9, 10, somewhere around there. That's one type of modeling. The next type of modeling is process modeling. Now, usually, when you process model, you use UML, Unified Modeling Language. And this is where you model business processes in an organization. So if I go to the doctor, I first have to call the doctor to make an appointment. If the doctor has room available, I can go to the doctor. And when I go to the doctor, I first have to indicate that I'm there. Then the secretary of the doctor will put my name into a system that I missed the appointment. Then I go to the doctor's office, and well, etc. And you can model all of that in a process model. And this is actually, there are complete courses at the university and complete online courses on how to do this. And this, when you work as an organizational consultant, as a business consultant, and usually then sometimes this is what you do. So when organizations hire you to optimize their internal organization, you first spend a lot of time to try to get a feel for the process and to model the existing process. And then the next step is to think, okay, we now have a huge process model. What steps can we cut out? How can we optimize information in the process? Do we need additional processes? So you use diagrams like this. Well, but then more formal, in order to model a complete process in an organization. But this is something that really is not explainable within not even a single lecture. So this is really a specific tool and a specific technology with a specific language and structure that you need to learn in order to do that. So we're not doing that. But I do want to spend some time to a more generic form of modeling, which is called information flow modeling. And that is not really process modeling, but it's kind of at a higher level, thinking about, okay, what information do we need in our organization to make sure that the organization keeps functioning? So for example, if I, as a customer, order something from a website, then information about the order should go from me to the organization. Then when it is in the organization, some of that information needs to go to the financial department. Some of that information needs to go to the production department. Some of it needs to go to shipping. There needs to be information flows between production and shipping, etc. So that is a type of modeling to get a basic feel for, okay, what type of information needs to flow across the organization in order to make sure that everything runs smoothly. So what you what was I about to say? Yeah, I think this also answered the question. So what I was about to say was, this is also what you have to do in your business plan. So in your business plan, you have to spend some time to explain the workings of your innovation. So for example, if you develop an app, then information needs to flow from the customer to the app, from the app to the suppliers or whatever. So you need to think a bit in your business plan about, okay, what information do I need in order to make sure that my innovation can happen in the first place, and what information flows through my innovation, if your innovation is something that is relevant for that. So you need to do that in your business plan, so in the second part of your business plan. In the exam, I can also ask you for, okay, what is the most important type of information that is needed for this innovation, for example. But because you have to do this in your business plan, I will probably not ask you in the exam to draw an information flow diagram yourself. So what this does is it identifies key flows of information in an organization, it identifies issues and potential improvements in terms of accuracy, speed and timeliness, efficiency and cost. So, okay, so basically, is every information flow we need in our organization, is it there? And is it there in the most efficient way? Or does it go through different steps that are, we can, for example, cut out? So the diagram contains sources and destinations, connections, and specifies the type of information. So basically the symbols, there's not a correct way of doing it, but the easiest is to use a circle with the name of the person, the part of the organization, which is the source and the destination of the information, and then arrows with the information flows. To give a concrete example, a very simplified information flow. This is an information flow of a airline booking department from a time that we used to fly. And this models the information that goes from the airline booking department to the check-in desk and the catering department. But again, quite simplified. So you have an airline booking department. They have a passenger list. So people or travel organizations booked seats with the airline booking department. They have a passenger list. The passenger list needs to go to the check-in desk. So that's an information flow. The check-in desk then has a boarding list with everyone who is basically is going to board the plane, and they are it's an information flow that goes back to the airline booking department. If you then add, for example, the catering, then when you book a flight, you can indicate your meal preference. You know, are you vegan, are you vegetarian, etc. And the meal requirements will go from the airline booking department to the catering department. And in turn, from the catering department, a meal list goes to the airline crew, so they know, okay, the person in seat 34G is vegetarian and needs a vegetarian meal. Things like that. Finally, the boarding list goes from a check-in desk to the airline crew, so they know how full the airplane is. Now, if you look at this information flow, then maybe you could see from, okay, maybe there are some additions I can make. So, you know, maybe there is something I can add. So if you have something like this, possibly you can add, okay, what I definitely want to do is I want to have a passenger count going from the airline crew to the check-in desk and then to the airline booking department. So the airline crew says, well, you have given me the boarding list, but not everyone is on the plane yet. Could you please try to find the remaining passengers? Or there is not someone who's on the plane who's not supposed to be in the plane. So maybe an information flow from the airline crew to the check-in desk would be wise to add, like a passenger count. Also, an information flow that would be less necessary, but maybe it would be somewhat useful to improve customer satisfaction, is to add feedback is to have an information flow from the airline crew to the catering department. So for example, by asking the airline crew after each flight, so how do you think people like the meals? So an information flow goes from the airline crew back to the catering department, which allows the catering department to maybe improve their meals they offer on flight, in the flight. So in this way, you could try to find out, okay, is there something we need to add? Is there something we can cut out, etc. And indeed, for a business plan, this is what you can do. So it's enough to. So what I would do in your business plan is to draw something like this with a very short explanation of what it means. So for example, if you have system A in the circle, then I need to know what system A is in order for me to understand the diagram. So this is I think a pretty simple way of thinking about information flows in organizations. And arguably the process modeling approach, in which you really basically model the complete process of an organization with the structured language approach. That one is better, but that one is also way more complicated. So to get a general insight and a general overview of how information travels through your organization, this is usually a very good first start. And especially as you will see when we start talking about technology and information systems in your organization, it is very important to think about, okay, what do these technologies do? Because information technologies, they make sure that all these that all these arrows can happen. So the only thing an information technology does is that it makes the arrows happen more efficiently, or more effectively, or more accurate. But that's everything an information technology does. So for example, Zoom is now an information technology, but it's the only thing it does is that it makes communication more efficient. So I could also go to your house or scream from outside the lecture to you, but it would be fairly inefficient with 160 students. So this just makes it much more efficient to teach. So basically, when you think about the role of information technology in an organization, information technology in an organization is just there to optimize the arrows between people who need information from each other, or departments or systems. So, but we'll talk more about that in a couple of weeks when we talk about the information systems themselves. Okay. So that was what I wanted to discuss last week, and then we can switch over to the lecture about structure and culture. I want to give a short outline, and then I suggest we have a short break of a couple of minutes, and then we continue with this. But just as a teaser, what we're talking about is the basic value chain of an organization, like a very, very old model by Porter from the 50s or 60s that explains the basic structure of an organization. I want to explain some structure dimensions. I think most importantly for you and for the exam is that there is a paper for this week's literature by Daft and Lengel about information and organizational structure, which I am not going to discuss in this lecture due to the time issues I encounter. So that is grayed out here, and those slides are hidden in the PowerPoint presentation. You don't need to know those for the exam, so we'll skip those. And then, but that will probably happen next week for the most part, is that we talk a bit about organization culture, and we talk about the typology of culture, which I think is very useful to classify organizations. So that's what we'll be doing after the break. So I suggest we have a break for about 3 minutes or so, enough for me and maybe for you to go to the toilet and have a cup of coffee. So I'll see you in a couple of minutes. Yeah, with next week, I mean next lecture week. Yeah. Repeat about. Oh yeah, I'm going to repeat about the article. No, have a break. I'm going to type it in the chat. So I'm back. I'm gonna allow other people a couple of minutes to come back as well. So which allows me that in the meantime, I can say that I really enjoyed the work group sessions last Wednesday. So I could only do 2 because I had other teaching obligations on Thursday and part of the Friday. So 2 assistants took over also because Peter could not do the work group sessions. But again, so I heard from Saskia and Nienke how it went, and so we talked a bit about afterwards about the different ideas and the different for innovations that you have, and we were really satisfied. With your business plan and the progress of all teams. So well done. And again, I really enjoyed it. It's always very fun to watch your presentations and to see what you came up with all your original ideas. So I hope you like it as well, but I really enjoyed myself last Wednesday. And of course, good luck with the next part of the business plan, because in a couple of weeks ago, we have the second presentation in which you comment on the organization. So, okay. Then we can continue with structure. Oh yeah, I can answer that now before we start. One, but your advice when we start with the database assignment. That's a very good point. I will make sure that because next week it's it's for the first time in like 6 weeks or so. It's a relatively quiet week for me. So next week I will finish the slides for the database lecture. So I will put the slides online already, so that you can start with the database assignment if you want. Though the database assignment is not that much work, and if you are seriously in doubt about whether you can do the assignment, it may be better to wait until the actual lecture so that I can help you with the assignment. So I think the database assignment takes maybe 3 hours or so, 4, something like that, I think. So if you have already if you have experience with database design, you can start the assignment now. If you want to do it, you can start it next week once I put the slides online. But you can also wait it out until the lecture, because that will give you enough, because then between the lecture and the deadline, you have enough time to do the assignment. And it's a pass or fail. I will explain the assignment in the lecture as well. But for now, to calm you down if you're a bit nervous about the assignment, is that it's not. So if the assignment is not okay, it's not a fail. So if the assignment, if you put effort in the assignment but still come up with the wrong solution for the database, you will still pass it. It's just to let you think about how it works. So it's an individual assignment. Yeah. Okay, value chain. Oh, sorry. So let's first talk a bit about the, let's first talk a bit about structure. So the structure of an organization is basically how you can classify an organization according to its formal aspects, according to its formal structure. So an organization structure is, well, the official definition by Mintzberg. Mintzberg wrote the book about organization structure, with the classification of different types of organization structures, which we will meet, some of which we will meet later on in the lecture. And he defines organization structure as the total sum of the ways in which its labor is divided into distinct tasks and its coordination achieved among these tasks. So it basically means, okay, how do you structure the labor in your organization? Who does what? And how do you need to communicate who does what and who is working on what type of task? So that's the formal definition of organization structure, but maybe easier, maybe it is easier to think about it simply in the way that an organization looks like formally. So departments, group size, functions, coordination, hierarchy, rules, things like that. So everything that you can classify and structure in an organization. So the basic way, also made by Porter, is the to classify the structure and to think of the structure of an organization is to look at the value chain. This one is mostly useful for basic production organizations, but can also be applied to other organizations, but a bit less. It's a bit less applicable to other types of organizations. So remember, this one was developed in the 50s, 60s or so. So when many organizations were still really production organizations like factories. So if you think of your prototypical factory, which actually makes stuff, then this value chain still applies pretty well. It's called a value chain because it basically means that things go into your organization and then go through your organization and go out of your organization again. And if all goes well, then the things that go into your organization have less value than the thing that goes out of your organization, because else you don't make a profit. So basically what you do as an organization, you have input, then you process that input, so you process that input into something else, and that something else is worth more than the input. So that's the basic value chain and the basic idea of an organization. And in order to do that, you need to, all those inputs need to be processed through the organization from inbound logistics to after-sales service. The value chain basically says, okay, what is in your organization that you need? So inbound logistics is the inbound logistics in your organization, so where you store the raw materials in your organization, you know, your storage centers, etc. Operations is everything that happens, so the actual thing that adds value, so where you create your product, you know, where you build your machines or whatever that you make. Outbound logistics is the outbound logistics, the warehouses you have to store your products, your distribution. Marketing and sales, well, obvious, and services, after sales service. So basically everything from your organization flows from inbound logistics right through service and after sales service. So that's the basic value chain, but in order to make the value chain happen, you need supportive functions in the value chain. And these are firm infrastructure, human resources, technology, and procurement. Firm infrastructure is management and finance, so that basically makes sure that the organization can function. So you need people who tell other people what to do. You need some kind of financial system in place in the organization. That's the firm infrastructure. Human resources, so you need to pay some attention to how people are doing. So you need to make sure that they are doing well. You need to hire people, well, etc. Human resources. Technology, you need people in information technology, and in production organizations, you need to have people who make sure that the machines keep functioning. So you need technology and people for that technology. Oh yeah, sorry, by the way, firm infrastructure is also the buildings. So like all the physical stuff in your organization, the buildings, the network, the computer monitors, things like that. Finally, procurement is the raw materials that go into your company. So like the people who buy the raw materials that then go to the inbound logistics. And this is basically the working of an organization. So especially in classic organizations who actually make stuff, this is a pretty good description of how the organization, of the structure of an organization and the different parts of the organization. This applies less to modern organizations in the service industry. So, for example, in the financial sector or in the sector that we are teaching, so we don't really have raw materials that we need to procure. But still, you can still classify most of the organization into the process like this. So, inbound logistics, for example, is all the stuff I read, all the literature, and then the operations is me turning it into a lecture. Outbound logistics is me putting the lecture online. Marketing and sales is less applicable, of course, but then teaching the lecture is maybe the output process. So the process changes a bit for our type of organization, but still you can create kind of a value chain for every organization. And of course, I, as a teacher, also need support. So we also have technology, human resources. We don't have that much raw material. Okay, I have a laptop and some pens, but that's basically it. And we have the infrastructure. So this basic process applies a bit less to service organizations, but still applies to a certain extent. And still, this is a very handy tool to think of the basic structure of an organization. So how you can use this for innovation? Well, you can think of how strong and weak each of the components of the value chain are for your organization. So in general, you can see, okay, where is the value that I can add in my organization that sets me apart from competitors. So is it the management? Is it the people in your organization? Do we have some kind of, is the way that we operate, the way that we produce our products unique? So what are the strengths and weaknesses of each component? So are we very good at logistics, or are we not that good at logistics? Are we very good at customer service or not that good at customer service? So you can basically do a SWOT analysis for every aspect of the organizations to see how strong and weak is each component and what the opportunities and threats are in each component. And based on that, you can basically do a kind of strategic analysis to see from, okay, well, okay, we are pretty good already at marketing and sales and service. Maybe we should aim for this and invest in new innovations that will allow us to be even better in marketing and sales. Or you can say, well, there's an opportunity in the market for buying a new machine that will make our internal operations more efficient. So maybe we should innovate our operations. So you can do a SWOT analysis for each of these components to see where opportunities and threats lie, what your strengths and weaknesses are, and use that to determine where and if you should innovate. Also, you could classify each of these resources according to, okay, how innovative are they? And usually you do that in terms of rare, valuable, durable, or inimitable. So for example, okay, the way we produce our products, so the way we have set up our production line, is that something that other organizations can't imitate? Is it really inimitable? Is it rare? Do you see that in no other organization or our organization? And if the answer to all of that is yes, then probably you have something that is really unique to you and that gives you competitive advantage. If the answer is no, but it's still very important to you, then maybe it's time to innovate and develop a strategy in order to make this part better. So that's how you can use the value chain. The main drawback of the value chain is that it has very little attention to human capital. So again, this is really made in the 50s, where most organizations were like factories and had distribution lines, etc. Nowadays, for most innovation, we rely on human capital. We rely on innovators. We rely on people with ideas and R&D departments. We rely on knowledge management in order to make innovation happen, especially in the service sector and information sector. And this value chain has little attention for that. As you see, there is no knowledge, there is no innovation or R&D in this value chain at all as a support mechanism. So it's still pretty much applicable and it's still a pretty useful tool to use. Many organizations use this as a basic strategic tool to see how their organization is doing, but it has some drawbacks, especially in terms of human capital. Okay, then the next thing I want to talk about is our structure dimensions of an organization. So basically, if you look at the definition of an organization, how can we classify an organization? So what does an organization look like in terms of all of this? Those are structure dimensions. And overall, there are 3 basic structure dimensions of an organization, which I think is important to remember for the exam as well. So they are departmentalization, centralization and span of control, and formalization and standardization. And you can classify organizations along these lines, dimensions. So let's start with departmentalization. Departmentalization is basically how is your organization, how is the basic organization structured? So in terms of roles and departments. So in general, you have two. Either you structure an organization functional, according to specialized roles for specific people, or you can structure an organization divisional, according to separate divisions of your organization. Oftentimes this is somewhat mixed, but these are the basic two dimensions. Okay, what does this mean? Well, it means basically this. Functional basically means you have an organization, and within the organization you have a marketing department, a production department, a research department, an IT department, a customer service department, whatever departments you need. So that's a functional division. Pretty logical, isn't it? On the other hand, you can have a divisional division. This is also called disaggregated division of your organization, or disaggregated structure. And that basically means that you have well, it says CEO, but you have general management and the strategy department, and below that are separate divisions. So if you are a company, like a pharmaceutical company, for example, you can have separate divisions, so one focusing on medical devices, one focused on consumer products, one focused on baby care. So it basically means you have separate, smaller organizations below the larger organization. And oftentimes you see that it's mixed. So especially larger organizations are divisional. So if you are a Unilever, a Procter & Gamble, a Philips, or whatever, you probably will have a divisional structure. Especially in the fast-moving consumer goods like Procter & Gamble, Unilever, and Nestle, they have like 1,000 different brands, and they have many different sub-organizations who create those brands, and those are usually divisions below the larger organization. And oftentimes, of course, it's mixed. So you have a divisional structure, and within the divisions, you have marketing, production, human resources. So it's often mixed. But then again, you can think about how exactly you mix it. So, for example, you could say, okay, at the top, now it's, for example, it only says CEO, which basically means management. But you could also say, okay, we centralize our human resource departments. Okay, so we have separate divisions, and each of these divisions have production and marketing. But human resources, we do that centrally in the organization. You could also say the IT, we do the IT department centrally in the organization. Or you could say, okay, the research and development, we do that centrally in the organization. But you could also say, okay, our divisions are so separate that we do research and development separately in each of those divisions. And everything has its advantages and disadvantages. So if you decentralize your research and development, it's really useful for that division, because that division has its own research and development. But if each division has its own research and development, then they do not communicate with each other. And that makes it less likely that they will work together in developing something new. So that may be an argument to have the R&D department as a functional division in your organization, so to have one R&D department for the entire organization. So it kind of, so it depends on how you want to structure your organization. Well, it kind of depends on many factors of what works best for your organization. Yeah, so divisional is mostly product based, but you can also have different divisions. So for example, the divisions we have at the university is along faculty lines. So we are in the Tilburg School of Humanities and Digital Sciences, so that's a division at our university, and within that division we have the schools, so communication and cognition is where we are located, and that's a subdivision of the faculty. And then some things in our organization are centrally regulated, IT, human resources, and some things are decentrally done. So usually it's so indeed that divisional is focused on the type of product, and within that type of product they have functional structure like marketing, human resources, etc. Yeah. But you can also have smaller divisions, so it's not that, so it doesn't stop in this figure. So usually you have usually the structured chart of the organization continues. So you have divisions and then subdivisions and maybe subdivisions. And it could also be that a division is just a team that works on a certain product. So, and the team itself doesn't need a marketing and human resource department because the team is too small. What you also oftentimes see in organizations, especially right now, is that they have a kind of a matrix organization in which they try to do both. And they do that in order to become more agile, which means that they can, agile development means that you can jump onto things you see in the markets more quickly and develop new products or new services more quickly, so you're better able to innovate. So many organizations have kind of a matrix structure in which you still have separate functions. So in this example, people are a business analysis developer, a tester, and you have management for the business analysis for the developers and the quality assurance managers for the testers. But you also have a divisional division along the different products you make. So this is a matrix organization in which people have, in which people are both member of a functional division and with a functional manager, and a division with a divisional manager. And you see this often in smaller teams and organizations. So people are part of different teams at the same time. So they work for a team which develops a certain product, but then in another part of their time they work on another product. So they work on different virtual teams for different divisions, but they are still, for example, marketeers or business developers or computer engineers who also have their own department. Yeah, smaller teams and self-steering teams. There are infinite ways that you can structure your organization. So you can have self-steering teams if you are more like a professional organization in which people are actually able to do that. In other organizations, you have not so self-steering teams because people have a higher need for management. So for example, the task is really unclear. So the team is not really self-steering, but you have like a manager for the team, but also a manager to which they have to make themselves accountable in a functional way. So the self-steering depends on the type of organization. So I think it may also be better explained in the next slide. So what you indeed see in more professional organizations, so most likely the organizations where you will end up working, is that it's really like more of a kind of in between a matrix structure and a network structure. So in which you have like smaller teams that are really indeed self-steering, that do their own project, that are responsible for their own output and for their own success. And that you can be a member of a different team at the same time, and that you can switch more rapidly from team to team. So kind of a network organization. To explain all that goes a bit far for this course. So we have courses in the master in which we explain the network-like structure of an organization and how that affects how organizations function. But in modern organization, it's you see that it is increasingly network-based. That's also, by the way, important for your business plan and for your organization. So I already saw that some of you had like, okay, we have a marketing department for innovation and we have a sales department. That's okay if you're part of a larger organization, but especially if you are a smaller organization, or if you are a division that is relatively uncoupled from the larger organization, then you usually see that the team is smaller and people have multiple roles in the team. So you have one people who does the marketing, who also does after sales support, and maybe who also keeps the website up to date. Which is kind of obvious, of course, because especially if you're a smaller organization, you cannot have a complete marketing department and you have and 6 managers and 3 divisions, etc. So usually people do multiple things. So basically the way that you can draw the structure of an organization in terms of functional, divisional, matrix-like, network-like, that is all part of the departmentalization aspect of organization structure. Basically means drawing an organization diagram. So that's one. The second one is centralization versus decentralization, and especially related to decision making. This is an aspect of structure which states how decision making happens within the organization. So in some organizations are really indeed self-steering teams. So every division or every team in an organization has a high degree of freedom to do their own work and to come up with new work to do. In other organizations are very top-down and are very centralized. So there's a manager who makes a decision, and it goes to a sub-manager, to a sub-sub-manager, etc. Think the army. Although that's not really true, because if you actually know how an army works, they're actually pretty much decentralized. So usually smaller groups within the army are really self-steering. So they get a briefing, so this is what you have to do, and then it's up to them to find out how they do it. Well, especially with the more specialized teams like commandos, they really have a high degree of autonomy. But basically the stereotype of what we think an army is basically a centralized structure. Also things like production organizations, factories, organizations like McDonald's, call centers in general are very centralized. So they're very top down. People saying, oh, this is what you have to do today. You have to make this many calls, you have to make this many hamburgers, and this is how you're going to do it. So centralized versus decentralized relates to where the decisions are made. So are the decisions made at the top of the organization or more at the bottom of an organization? So the people have a lot of power to create their own work and make a lot of decisions themselves. But it also relates to the number of different layers the decisions flow through. So you have, so that's called the span of control, or the hierarchy of an organization. Span of control is a better word. And that relates to how tall or how flat an organization is. So some organizations are really tall, so they have a CEO, they have sub-managers of the CEO, sub-managers, sub-sub-managers, etc. So a lot of layers. Other organizations are relatively flat, which basically means from someone in production all the way to the CEO is only like 3 or 4 steps. So for example, Toyota, the car manufacturing company, looks like it would have a pretty high span of control, but in reality, they have a pretty flat structure. So I think in 3 or 4 steps, you're all the way to the CEO of an organization, because they think it's very important for the different parts of the organizations to be as decentralized as possible, with a large degree of autonomy for the individual workers, which we will see next week in 2 weeks, why that is important. So that's the second aspect of structure: formalization, standardization. Centralization, decentralization. The final one is formalization and standardization. And this relates to how formal is your work. So what is the degree of freedom in your daily work? It kind of looks like centralized and decentralized decision making, but it's a bit different, because the previous one relates to the managers who explain what you have to do. This relates to the extent to which your work is formalized. So the extent to which there are explicit procedures, rules to do your work. And this relates to control versus coordination. So can you do your work as you like with your colleagues, or is there a lot of control in terms of rules, how to do your work? So again, think McDonald's, in which there is a lot of formalization. You know, it's up to the specific ingredients and amounts. It's really structured and formalized how you should create a Big Mac. So with a lot of formalization. Also, if you work in an Apple store, if you're an Apple genius, it looks like it's free, but it's not. There's a high degree of formality on how you should address customers. So there's actually like a 100-page manual or so that explains in detail how you should deal with every type of customer. So if you see the image here, it talks about learnable phrases. An example: I want an iPad, but I need a mouse. I can deal with all this touching. Genius must then say, I may know how you feel. I'm a mouse fan myself and felt like I never get used to it. So really formalized how you should answer. Basically the same as a call center. Also very formalized with all those formal databases that explain to you what you should say to your customer. So that's the third one. So if you take all of these three dimensions together, so if you take departmentalization and especially centralization versus decentralization and formalization and standardization together, you get two archetypes of organizations. And these are two kind of extremes of how you can structure an organization. So in reality, every organization is probably is in between. But I think this is a useful way to look at the basic ways an organization can be structured. So on the one hand, you have a machine bureaucracy, as it is called, according to Mintzberg, which is a very mechanistic structure. So it is centralized, it's formal, it's hierarchical. So it's basically based on control. Again, take McDonald's. The other archetype of organizations are professional organizations, and they are also called organic organizations, so professional or organic. Those are organizations that are flexible, decentralized, flat, informal. So and they are based around coordination instead of control. So people coordinate and communicate among themselves how they should do their work. And you can classify organizations along these two extremes of a dimension. But it's important to realize that an organization that, especially in larger organizations, different parts of the organization may have different kinds of structures. So if you work for a McDonald's and make hamburgers, then you work in a machine bureaucracy-like structure. But if you would work at McDonald's headquarters or at the R&D department of McDonald's, then probably your part of the organization will be more organic, more professional structure. So it's not that you can say an organization is completely this or completely that. It probably also depends on the department or the division that you're in. This, maybe if we have time left, but first I want to do this slide so that we have a good ending for this lecture. So if you think of innovation in an organization, you could, so your first thought would be, which is probably also a good thought, is that, okay, if you think about innovation in an organization, you need to have a professional, organic-like structure because that is more suitable for innovation. And that's true. So organizations who deal with, people in an organization who deal with innovations are probably best seated in a professional structure and in a division that is more geared towards coordination. However, you can also innovate in those larger organizations. So especially if you're a marine machine bureaucracy, you will probably innovate a lot in new technologies, new information technologies that will make your process more efficient. So it's not that there is no innovation in these organizations, it's only a different type of innovation. But people who are working who develop innovation, so people in the R&D department, is probably always kind of a professional structure like. You see that as an organization becomes larger, it would become a bit more difficult to innovate. On the one hand, you would say for organizations larger, so they have a huge budgets for innovation, but an organization oftentimes becomes less flexible if they are larger. So what organizations usually do is they have spin-offs, or they have a separate R&D department that is relatively set apart from the organization in a more organistic structure, so that they keep that flexibility in the R&D department. So they can also isolate R&D teams to negate groupthink, so they set them apart so that they so they could also say, okay, well, yeah, we don't have one R&D department, but we have several R&D departments in separate divisions, so that they can come up with different ideas, and then we can put all those ideas together, because if you have one R&D department, they may miss important information that is happening elsewhere in the organization, so to negate groupthink. A final solution is that you create kind of dynamic tension in a larger organization, which basically means you have a lot of reorganizations in your organization, so people have to keep flexible, which basically means people are, then assigned to one project, and a couple of years later or a couple of months later they're assigned to another project, so that people keep working on different things, so that they keep their flexibility. As a final example, for example, IBM internally has been called "I've been moved" a lot, because IBM really wants to work in an agile fashion, in an organistic fashion, while being a very large organization. So they continuously move people around the organization, across division, even across countries, in order to make sure that people keep flexible and keep innovative. So that's how a large organization can deal with innovation. Again, I didn't make it completely through the lecture, but finally, we ended at the exact point at which I would expect it to end this lecture. So we dealt with organization structure. So next week, sorry, 2 weeks, I can do organizational culture, and I can explain 2 models about how people and innovation in an organization relate to each other. And that will make a complete lecture. So that's what we're going to do in 2 weeks. For now, we call it quits, and I won't see you next week, but I will see you in 2 weeks. So all the best with your midterm exams, if you have any, and I'll see you in 2 weeks. So thank you very much, and good luck. Thank you, and see you.